Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. As we continue our way through the Amidah, we've actually made it tonight to the 12th bracha in the Amidah. So we're almost there. We're getting there to a total of actually 19 brachot. And tonight actually brings us to essentially what makes the Amidah go from 18 Shmona Esrei to essentially having a 19th bracha as well. So tonight our focus is going to be on the 12th bracha, which is known as Birkat Haminim, literally the blessing of the minim, of the heretics, essentially. So just for kind of ground rules, pieces here, it's not exactly a blessing. Birkat Haminim is more accurately translated as a malediction. It's essentially a curse, right? We call it Birkat Haminim, the blessing of the minim, but it's really the curse of the minim, of the heretics. And tonight, what I want to focus on in particular is who is this text written for, right? Who are we talking about in this text, right? So if you look at the modern text that we have today, and we'll look at it in just a few moments, there's a couple references to different groups of people, but it's not really clear who we're talking about. So what I want to look at this evening is to figure out historically who were the people that we were talking about in this bracha. And the real question is, will we be able to discover who exactly are the people we're referencing in this bracha? But another question related to that is, how did this bracha remain in the siddur for so many generations? We know that over the generations, not only did the church censor out texts, but we self-censored our texts as a protection, as a mechanism to protect ourselves. So how is it possible that such a text remained in the Amidah for so many years until today? So that's kind of some of the questions I want to think about this evening, and we'll look at a couple of interesting texts tonight, many of which are not actually kind of within the Jewish tradition in particular, but actually we're going to be looking at a couple of Christian texts as well because of the way in which they interacted with this particular bracha as well. I'm going to share the source sheet in the chat for those of you who did not receive it, and we'll get started. Okay. I'll pull it up right now. Okay, so let's begin by just looking at the text we have in front of us today, because that'll get us started. And then from here, we'll try to figure out exactly who we're talking about in our text and whether or not we can even decipher it from the text we have in front of it. So we know the bracha, V'lamal shenim, I'll zoom in a little bit, V'lamal shenim al ti tikva, right? Let there be no hope for the malshinim. Malshinim is translated here. It's a peculiar word. Malshinim, it's informers. So who would the malshinim be? You can call it out. Who would an informer be a reference to? I see some people mouthing, but I don't.
Like during the Inquisition, like people who told the authorities that people were practicing Jews.
Yeah, so one way to say, listen, malshinim are Jews who essentially are ratting at other Jews, right? They're going to the government in a time where the government was not friendly to Jews, and they were handing over Jews to the authorities. So malshinim would be a Jew.
No, but it could be a non-Jew.
So that's going to be the question to figure out. Are we talking about Jews or non-Jews in the bracha before us this evening?
Well, why does it have to be either or?
So that's a good point. We're gonna come back to that. But generally speaking, the word malshin generally refer to a Jew who ratted out another Jew, right? If you're talking about a non-Jew, so it could talk about non-Jews in other terms. This is seemingly a term referencing Jews that are kind of harming other Jews. That seems to be the text, the context of this particular word, but we'll see kind of getting back to Steve, we'll see how that works out at the end.
Was that written in the time of the Ramban when he had that debate with the I forget his name?
So the debates, we're going to get to some of those debates later, but this bracha, we'll see in a moment, was instituted 2,000 years ago. And something else happened 2,000 years ago, and we'll get to that. We just celebrated 2021. So we understand that 2,000 years ago an event happened, and around 2,000 years ago this bracha was instituted. So we'll see if there is any connection between those two major events in human history. So let there be no hope for these malshanim, these people who seem to be ratting out their neighbors. And all wickedness, we're not talking about a person in that word, risha, all wickedness, kerega toived, in one moment should be erased. V'chol oivecha. Now here's a term, getting back to Steve's question, is an oyev a Jew or a non-Jew? Either or.
It can be both.
It seems to be that it could be both, right? We know that often in the Torah it refers to a non-Jewish nation, right? The wars seem to be an oyev is a non-Jew, but oyev can also be a Jew who seems to have turned their backs on Judaism. So mehirai karetu, cut them off. So it's interesting, the language karet, often we think about in reference to Jews, right? That a Jew gets karet. Right? We don't usually talk about that word with non-Jews, but it could also just be a word referencing kind of remove them from this earth or from the afterlife as well. Now we move on to another word, v'hazedim. What is a zaid? A hazedim, mehirat ta'aker. So the translation here, again, a loose translation is...
Bemazed is the sin on purpose?
So yeah, so like bemazed, what does bemazed mean? It means somebody who sins on purpose. Mazed, it's you've done an egregious sin on purpose. So generally, again, a mazed is somebody who seems, it's a Jew who has done something bemazed. So if you want to take that route, so mezidim meherat ta'aker u'tshaber. So now we're using all of these words, uproot them, crush them, rout them out, subdue them. It seems that it could be Jews, Zaydim, and it could also be non-Jews. Often texts refer to, especially in the prophets, like Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, in reference sometimes even to Paro, talk about the non-Jewish nations that have ruled over Jews in the same word, using the same root, Adon or Zaydim. So again, it could be Jews or non-Jews, but you notice the perhaps intentional ambiguity in the text, which may help it stay in our siddur a little bit longer than it could have been, because it could have been totally taken out from the siddur over the generations, and we'll see to what extent it may have been censored. The hazedim, remove them again.
We didn't cover the question as to like why we're using extreme forms, oivim and zaydim. I mean, what about those who are just a little more subtly anti-Semitic or dangerous to us? We're not hoping that they too are thwarted in their attempts against us?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say you're absolutely right in the sense that these are very extreme terms. This is not just simply, somebody who's off the path, like get them back on the bandwagon. I think when they instituted this bracha, and we'll see in the next source the history of the institution of this bracha, it was specifically written against those who were egregiously acting against Jews. It wasn't just, like you said, kind of a minor anti-Semitism, perhaps, but what we'll see is that it seems to be something more fundamental, whether it was physical attacks on Jews, which later will be important, especially in Christian lands, but in the origin, it actually was much more theological. Right, so we talked about a malshin as somebody who maybe rats out a Jew, and there's physical harm that could be taken place. But an oyev and even a zayd, a zaydim, are words that could just be used, perhaps even about a Jew who is simply acting out against other Jews, not even physically, spiritually, meaning claiming that there's an issue theologically with Judaism, and that'll tie into perhaps some questions of sectarianism that we'll look at in a few minutes. But that's a good point. This bracha was clearly formulated not just against minor actions, but seemingly major offenses. And make them low, meaning make them low, not only destroy them, uproot them. It's like, let's use as many like words we can use to annihilate these people. Again, we're asking God to do it, not us specifically. God should do these things. Quickly, right? Just as we said, kerega bimheira, like we want this to happen chick-chock right now. in our days. Baruch atah Hashem shover oivim umachnia zedim. Break the oyev umachnia and kind of and subdue, lower the zedim, the insulin. Okay, so you see the repetition of the word oyev and zedim, not the word malshinim, which is interesting because often a bracha will try to pick back up on some words or themes that emerged earlier. So oyev seems to be part of the text and it makes sense. Zedim seems to make sense. Malshinim only appears once and it opens the bracha, which is interesting considering it doesn't really come back to them later, right? It's a specific type of sin, somebody who brings another Jew to the authorities, but it doesn't seem to come back specifically to that, nor at the end of the bracha. So we'll have to kind of address some of those questions. What's this bracha called? Right, I mentioned it to you. It's called Birkat Haminim. What is absent from this bracha?
You mean in the name?
The name, it's called Birkat Haminim, the blessing or the malediction, really the curse of the minim. In the text itself, what word are we missing?
Well, the bracha is missing from the beginning of it, right? It doesn't start off Baruch atah Hashem.
So it doesn't, correct, but most of the middle bracha, right? The middle bracha won't start that way. They'll just start with a word, and they'll only end with a bracha. But it's called the malediction of the mean, the heretic. The word
Because it doesn't have a verb. It doesn't have a verb, like what to do with the heretic. Like you would think the name.
even a step before.
The word mean is missing. We have mashin, but we don't have.
It's called Birkat Haminim, and the word mean does not even appear in the bracha itself. Right? That's striking off the bat, right? Before you even get started, the name of the bracha doesn't appear in the bracha. And the name of the bracha, as we'll see in a moment, already appears in the Gemara and the Tosefta, meaning they refer to it as the Birkat Haminim. So it seems a little strange that the word mean does not appear. There's a couple of ways in which we could go. Any theories why it doesn't appear?
Aren't meanim people who betray others?
So a mean would be considered somebody who would essentially be a heretic. So that would be kind of the word used. So that would be either a Jew who jumped ship, or a Jew who's so far off that we would consider him no longer part of the tribe of Jews. That's usually who a mean is a reference to.
Maybe the word mean is inclusive of all those.
So maybe mean is like
I was going to say that, yeah.
So you would hope if that were the case, then maybe the bracha would start off by saying, instead of v'la malshanim, it would say uminim, right? That malshanim should be the header, minim should be the header, and then it should continue onward. So
was meaning there in an earlier text, and it just that's a piece of it that just is no longer with us.
So that's Marcus is picking up on one potential theory, which is, well, maybe the word mean was the original term, right? Malshanim is a specific type of, it's more specific. So it's odd that they would open with a very specific type of person. So maybe it really started viminim. So that's one potential theory, and we'll get to that.
Malshinim is an act, and someone who takes action to I don't know how you say it, to rat on someone else and to cause damage actively.
Yeah, so that could be potentially why you might want to put it up front. While a mean, you might say, well, they didn't necessarily harm anyone. They just, they converted out. They're an apostate, right? Maybe that's a different type of sin.
Is there a relationship between the two words, lamalshinim and minim?
No, they're not etymologically related. Yeah.
So it must be related to an event.
What do you mean?
Where La Malshin, where the Malshin was the main character, or the most important factor.
So perhaps, right, I just said this bracha is the 19th bracha, meaning it becomes number 12, but it's added after the Amidah is already added. So maybe let's look at how it was added, and that's what we're going to look at right now, and that'll help us understand the current text. So these are all essentially theories that we're going to try to figure out to see how exactly the bracha came about. And with that, we'll jump in just a moment to the actual kind of the history part that the Gemara and bracha relates. Yes.
I don't know where I'm getting this from, but I thought the word min or minim had to do with sexuality?
So yeah, the word mean can also mean that in modern Hebrew, but in the context of rabbinic texts, minim is a reference to a heretic, not sect. Correct. Good point. Yeah.
How did one get to the other?
Is min specific to the early Christians, or is it
So
other?
that's a very likely contender for who we're talking about in this bracha. We'll have to see if that is indeed the case, or is that a way to connect the two. So that's what we're going to have to figure out tonight. Yeah, we have a lot to figure out. Okay, so let's look at the origin of the bracha itself. Just try to figure out exactly what the bracha was and perhaps some earlier texts as to how it got to the way that we see it. Just before we get there, source number one, we've seen this Gemara in Brachos many times over. It's a list of the order. Why does this bracha appear here? Remember, this is the 19th bracha. They added it later. They put it here because remember the bracha that we just talked about is about mishpat. It's about justice. So now that we've essentially talked about justice, kevan shenasa din barashaim kalu haminim. Just as we have now done justice, din, notice to the Rishon. In the last bracha, we talked about justice. It's not only justice in essence for good people to get, let's say, patted on the back. That's going to be the next bracha. Let's tzadikim. The last bracha was really about mishpat, justice, and who gets justice meted out to them? Somebody who's erred. So what happens is this bracha, the 12th bracha, is essentially an addition. It's an addendum to the previous bracha. Now we're going to talk about the minim. Again, birkat haminim. Again, note how that word does not appear in our text. V'kol el hazeidim, and included are all the zaydim, anybody who does wickedness. And as there's a bracha that talks, as the pasuk in Isaiah says, v'shaver poshim v'chataim yachtav, right? They're all the evil people are going to be broken down together. Importantly, minim appears here. Again, a min is a reference to somebody who essentially has either left the Jewish fold or somebody who's so far off that other Jews won't consider them part of their community for theological reasons. So Megillah, the Gemara in Megillah talks about a min. Our bracha does not. The Gemara in Bracha gives us the origin story, right? The story of the addition of Birkat Haminim. Some of you may be familiar with the story, parts of the details of the story, which is the story of a rabbi in the 1st century CE. And again, I referenced the 1st century before because it's a happening century, right? It's a century of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. It's the century in the founding of Christianity, right? This is a busy time in human history. And Birkat Haminim is established at that moment. The Gemara tells us they have the bracha, right? Tanu Rabbanan, Shimon Hapkuli Hister Shmona Esrei bracha. The Shmona Esrei we already learned in the 1st session that was established by Shimon Hapkuli before Rabban Gamliel in Yavne, right? There's a machloket, was it then or was it even the beginning of Bais Sheni? But nevertheless, it was established. Amar Lahem Rabban Gamliel Lechacham. Rabban Gamliel, who's the leader, is the Nasi of the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, says, Klum yesh adam sheyodea letakin birkat haminim. Rabban Gamliel asks the rabbis, we need to add another bracha. We need to add a bracha that essentially curses out the minim, the heretics. So Rabban Gamliel, as the leader of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, recognizes that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. So we're going to have to figure out what the problem is to understand how this addresses the problem. So just keep that in mind as we read through the text. So Amad Shmuel HaKatan. So who's going to do it? Shmuel HaKatan. He's a Tana living in the land of Israel. He says, I'm going to do it. So what happens? He establishes the text. So now every shul in the land of Israel has now a 19th bracha, the bracha of Birkat Haminim. The next year, the story goes, he forgot it. Shmuel HaKatan, the person who wrote the bracha himself, forgot it. So what happened? He's standing at the Amud, about davening from the Amud, Shmona Esrei, and they're doing Chazarat HaShatz, and he forgets that bracha. It's not that he skipped, he couldn't remember the words. And remember, they didn't often have Sidurim, they didn't have texts in many places. So he's sitting there for hours, he couldn't remember it. And so what happens? The Gemara asks, wait, why didn't they switch him out? Right, I'll stop share for a moment. There's a halacha that if somebody forgets to say that bracha, or if somebody repeats certain words in the Shemona Esrei, you have to replace them. Why? It's not that they just forgot. there's a theological issue. So for example, if somebody says modim, modim at the towards the end of Birkas, at the end of the Amidah, we replace them with a new davener. Why? Because modim sounds like I'm davening to two different gods. It's as if there's two different deities. So therefore, we replace them. And if somebody skips this bracha, what does that mean?
That they were potentially heretics themselves.
Heretics, because remember, in a world where, not that words don't have meaning today, but in a world where curses and blessings had a lot more meaning to an individual probably 2,000 years ago than they unfortunately mean to us today, you're not going to curse yourself or your family from the Amud. Right? So you're not going to stand up there and curse yourself because you know that the rabbis established it against you. So again, who is the you in the bracha? So we'll have to still it's an open-ended question at the moment. But so the individual, Shmuel HaKatan, forgot the text. So they didn't replace him because they knew he was the one who wrote it. So essentially they kind of bent the rules a little bit for him because they understood that he didn't mean any harm. So says the Gemara. So Shmuel HaKatan eventually, he remembers it, they figure it out, all is good in the end. But let's just jump down here for a moment. Okay, so all is good in the end, but I'm just going to explain a little bit outside. Shmuel HaKatan establishes it in the 1st century. Just a little history. Who's popular in the 1st century CE in the land of Israel? Let's throw out some names, and there's not one right answer here. Who are the players in the 1st century CE?
Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi Akiva. So we have Rabbi Akiva, let's say, representing, going 1st to 2nd century, representing kind of Jews, or as often referred to in both rabbinic texts and also in Christian texts, the Pharisees, right? The rabbinic Jews. That's the Rabbi Akivas, that's the Rabban Gamliels, that's the Shmuel HaKatans. Who else do we have?
You have the Romans.
The Romans, exactly.
The Romans is later, so it's Shimon Bar Yochai also.
Exactly. I mean, the Romans ruled in the land for centuries. So you have the Romans, and they're the ones who destroyed the second Beit HaMikdash. Who else?
Bar Kochba?
So we'll have him toward the 2nd century, and he's again also Jews, Pharisees, but besides kind of Jews in the very particular fashion of rabbinic Jews, right? The people who wrote the Mishnah.
Yeah.
Who else is running around the land of Israel?
The Tzedukim.
The Sadducees. So who are the Sadducees?
Kohanim?
So many of them were Kohanim. The Sadducees did not believe in the oral Torah, right? So many of them happened to have been the Kohanim during the Second Temple period, and they did not believe in the oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh. So that could be one other group. There's a couple other groups. Anybody ever been to Masada? I know the answer is yes.
The Essenes.
The Essenes, right, which was like a sectarian Jewish community that had unique practices and kind of separated themselves off from kind of the temple and had their own type of worship down in Masada. So you have all these different groups which we could kind of lump as sectarians. And the only reason we can call them sectarians is because in the end of the day, we kind of won out, right? If we had not continued on, they'd be calling us the sectarians. So essentially you have all these other groups, and any one of these groups, maybe excluding the Romans for a moment, could essentially be the group that's being referenced in this 1st century bracha. Because remember, these are people who would daven in your shul. But there's another group.
So
What about
would be
Jesus?
included too.
The early Christians, that's the other group I wanted to reference. So the early Christians is essentially the next group. And something that is important to know about 1st century Judaism is that the early Christians, in its until really the 2nd century, were not considered essentially a different religion. It wasn't seen that way. In the 1st century, they were essentially a sect of Jews, right? Early 1st century Jewish Christians, and I'll use that term, Jewish Christians, were believers in the Torah, and also people who believed in the Savior and their Messiah. And the Jews who followed that Messiah still practiced Judaism. Right? Eventually, Gentiles would enter the fold, and eventually they would stop, and they believed no longer that you had to keep the Old Testament. They had the New Testament. That all comes about. But in the 1st century CE, in the northern parts of Israel, where essentially this would have been popular, this additional bracha that was added in, Jews and Christians were often davening in the same shul. Now, eventually they broke up. So early
Until Paul came along.
group for this bracha. Yes. Did Ellie have a? Okay. So early Christians, Essenes, Sadducees, all of these are potential groups for who we're talking about. All of these could potentially be considered, you could call them Amin, certainly the Sadducees, maybe not the Essenes, certainly the Sadducees, and certainly the early Christians. Again, it would have to be somebody who is close enough to you that would daven in your own shul, because if they're too far away, you don't need to curse them out because they're not among your community anymore. So that's why I want to exclude Romans. I want to exclude the original text having any reference essentially to non-Jews, because really we were talking about people who were considered part of the community at the time of its kind of writing, of its formulation in the 1st century CE. Okay. Up until this point, we have not seen any reference, though, to specific people. Right? That's kind of the irony of the bracha is we're cursing out somebody, but who are we cursing? I just gave you like 3 different groups we could be cursing. So who are we cursing out? And for that, we have to turn to a number of Christian sources, because those are the best sources for this particular type of investigation. And the reason we have to do so is because we don't have Jewish texts from these time periods, right? We have Geniza texts, which are 1,000 years old, maybe 1,100 years old, but we have no texts that still exist from much earlier time periods. What I mean by that is the following. Yes, we have the Mishnah. Yes, we have the Gemara. But the Gemaras that we have, the earliest manuscripts we have of the Gemaras are 1,000 years old. So we don't know what could have changed in the text from the previous 1,000 years, right? Because we don't have a scroll that says what the bracha was. Right? We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example.
That's it, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
They don't reference this bracha, right? Because this bracha essentially came after probably almost all of the Dead Sea Scrolls were already written. So that's where we're left with. And therefore, we have to turn to kind of non-Jewish sources to help us. And you always have to look critically at them as well, because maybe they're not telling the whole story. So that's what I want to look at with you in a moment. So first, I just want to show you one Jewish source. This may be one of our last Jewish sources in this arrangement.
What about the Book of Maccabees?
So the Book of Maccabees is older also, so it doesn't have this bracha. Source number 3, and I want to tell you a lot of the sources we'll be looking at in the next few minutes come from the book Cursing the Christians, A History of the Birkat Haminim, which is published in 2012 by Dr. Ruth Langer. She's a professor up, I believe, in Boston College. And if you don't know her work, you should get acquainted with it. She has a lot on the Siddur. That's her field, and especially Jewish-Christian relations. You may know her at least through her husband, who's Dr. Jonathan Sarna. So so that might remind you. He spoke at the Jewish Center 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, so this is a text from the medieval period in medieval Ashkenaz, right? Very few Siddurim in medieval Ashkenaz have the following text, and that's why it's unique. What's the first word in this bracha?
Meshubadim.
What is a meshumad? It's another term, another phrase to add to our list of people we're cursing.
Heretic.
It's a heretic, so it's a heretic, but it might go one step further.
Meshumad is a convert.
Is an apostate, exactly. And meshumad is more specific than a min. A min is a heretic, fine. They could still be Jewish and still claim they're Jews. They're Jewish, right? So one could claim, it's thinking about the early modern period. Many Jews became, let's say, heretics, but they were still Jewish. A meshumad is an apostate, meaning they left the fold. So a meshumad here would refer to somebody who converted to Christianity.
It's lower, it's to multitexting.
So that's why meshumad would not appear in most texts, because who's a meshumad cursing out? Jews who now are Christian. And if you're living in medieval Ashkenaz, guess what you don't want to do in your own siddur that you daven from 3 times a day? you don't want to have a text that curses out your neighbors, right? Jews were persecuted and killed for centuries, often instigated by actually apostates, and we'll see that in a moment in all the major debates between famous rabbis, the Ramban, Rabbi Buechler of Paris, and we'll see that in a moment. They were all debating apostates, right? Because who knew the Talmud well? Jews who became Christians. So l'mashumadim al tihi tikva, that's the language that is used here. And v'chol haminim, the word min appears in this particular text. So again, minim is more perhaps a general term. I don't want you to think though that this is the original text, because remember, this is from 800 years ago. We still don't know if the original text started with the word mashumadim. Maybe that was at some point altered to reflect the reality of Jews living in Christian lands. But it's unclear that that is really the original text. And note the following addition also, Umalchut Zadon, the kingdom of wickedness, Mehera Te'aker. What's the additional word Malchut, kingdom, kind of refer to here or kind of add meaning?
Well, in the Rhineland, it's not the Romans.
Correct. And Malchut Zadon here.
Like the Vatican.
Yeah, once you add the word Malchut, you're no longer talking about your neighbor, you're talking about an institution. You're talking about a government. And so the additional word Malchut here seems to be a serious reference to Christendom, whether that's the actual church itself or Christian kingdoms in which Jews lived under. The word Malchut has an extra layer meaning. So you can understand why finding this text is important for Jewish history when it comes to liturgy, because we don't have the word Malchut in most Jewish texts, in most Ashkenazic texts, nor the word Meshumad. However, it could be the case, we can't prove this, but it could be the case that Jews davened a text similar to this, even though it didn't say it in their siddur. We know this from Aleinu, which although was omitted by many communities for centuries, many communities said it be'al peh, right? They knew the words, they just didn't have it in their siddur. And the same could be argued for in this particular text as well. But again, no specific reference to Christians or Christianity, even though if you're a Jew living in medieval Christian lands, you know who Meshumad is and you know who Malchut Zadon is. Nevertheless, it doesn't necessarily explicitly state it. What is going to tip us over into figuring out who specifically we're referring to? What word would we need in our text to tell us that we're talking about perhaps potentially early Christians? Well, what is the Hebrew word for Christian?
Notzri.
Notzar is the Hebrew word. So it's interesting. Where does that word come from?
Nazaret.
Where does it come from?
Nazaret. It's Nazareth.
Nazareth. Nazareth.
Nazareth.
Nazareth. Right. So the reason that Christians are referred to as Notzrim in Hebrew is because Nazareth is the city of Nazareth, which is where Jesus was born or came from, depending on Buechler, Nazareth. So Notzrim referred to the followers of the one who was from Nazareth. There's been a lot of research done about the etymological origins of this word, but I think from a basic perspective, it's a reference to Christians who were called Nazareans in the first and second, and maybe even into the third centuries as well. So with that, I want to show you a few Christian sources, because if Jews are saying something that's offensive to Christians, you better bet that the Christians are going to be writing about it. So let's look at what they wrote about in the 4th century. Epiphanius wrote a work called Panarion, which is a book that was written to explain to other Christians essentially how to debate Jews and how to reference the kind of the wicked ways of the Jews, right? So this book was written to do so. He was the Bishop of Cyprus, and it seems to be the case that he may have also been an apostate himself, or he may have been born a Jew and converted later on. So he wrote the following: yet these are very much the Jews' enemies, meaning Christians. Not only do Jews have a hatred of them, They even stand up at dawn, midday, and evening, Shachris, Mincha, Mariv, 3 times a day when they recite their prayers in the synagogues and curse and anathematize them, right? We curse them. 3 times a day, they say, God curse the Nazarenes. Right, so this text was originally written, I believe, in the Greek. But the word that he uses here is Nazarenes. So we don't know for sure if that was the text, but we're going to see it repeat itself over and over again in Christian texts. So it likely was one of the texts that Jews were reciting. I can't claim that it was the original text because, again, unless we have manuscripts really from the 1st century, we can't claim it one way or the other. But it would seem that Jews were saying that. For they harbor an extra grudge against them, if you please, because despite their Jewishness, they preach that Jesus is the Christ, the opposite of those who are still Jews, for they have not accepted Jesus. Meaning, Jews are cursing Christians because we Jews have not accepted their Messiah. So Epiphanius is writing, and he writes that we curse out Christians specifically. Now, maybe we weren't, and they wanted to say that we did. Meaning, this would not be the first time in human history that Jews were the claims were made against us that were false. However, these claims were most likely true, as we do have a few other references throughout Jewish history to them as well. So I want to show you a few others that will kind of show us a little bit more about the history here. Source number 5. So we're all famous. We all probably know that the Ramban had a famous debate with Pablo Cristiani later on in the 13th century. But earlier we have a debate between Nicolas Donin in 1240 in France, who was a Jew who became an apostate, became Christian, and he debated in Paris Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris was a major Tosfot of the time period, and he lived in France, in Paris, and they had a debate. Meaning he was obliged essentially to defend Judaism against the church. And one of the arguments that Nicolas Donin wrote about in his Extractions de Talmud, which was extractions from the Talmud, meaning he was taking out texts that were challenging for Jews. For Christians, excuse me. So one of the pieces that he argued against was the following: 3 times every day, in a prayer which they consider more important than others, the Jews curse the clergy of the church, the kings, and all other people, including hostile Jews. The clergy of the church, the kings, what reference would be the clergy of the church, the kings? Malchut Zadon could be a reference to the kings and to the leaders of the church, because a malchut represents more than just my neighbor. It represents the institution as a whole. This prayer is in the Talmud and ought to be recited standing with feet together, a reference to the Amidah. One should not speak about anything else nor interrupt it until it's completed, even if a serpent is around one's ankle, as the Mishnah in Brachos tells us. And again, he was born and raised a Jew. This prayer, this is an interesting additional piece. Men and women recite at least 3 times a day, men in Hebrew and women in the vernacular, and in both cases in a whisper. Moreover, the priest, meaning the Chazan, recites it twice in a loud voice, Shachris and Mincha, and all respond Amen to every such curse. The paragraph of this prayer in which they curse us, as we have discussed above, is of such a sort, and he goes on. So it occurs and it appears in a debate in 1240, which ended. Does anybody know what was the ending of this debate?
Isn't that the year the Talmud was burned?
In 1242, the Talmuds in France were gathered together as a result of this debate and publicly burned in the streets of Paris. And Maharam of Rothenburg, who was a student of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris in France at the time, witnessed the burning and wrote the famous Kina that we recite on Tisha B'Av about the burning of the books in Paris. So we know this piyut and we know this piece of history. And what's interesting to add to this is that Rabbi Yechiel of Paris responds, right? It's a debate. We have Rabbi Yechiel of Paris's response to Nicolas Donin, and what his response was fascinating. I didn't bring it to you. I'm just going to read you an excerpt from it. He says the following: when defending the bracha of V'lamal Shenim Al Tikva, what does he say? He says the following: the bracha only applies to people who recognize who reject the creator himself. Meaning it's not rejecting, it's not cursing out you Christians because you believe in a God. He says, rather, the bracha itself is referring to a series of kings from the time of the Bible. This is his response. Beginning with Pharaoh, who denied God in spite of experiencing all of God's miracles, and continuing with the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Assyria. All of these nations, he says, killed Israel, exiled them from their land, slaughtered them, fought against them, burned their temple and sanctuary, and daily decreed against them evil forms of death, and never did anything good for the Jews. However, he says, we pray about those empires, but we are grateful for the goodness of this realm and this pope. So you can understand what it meant to have to defend Judaism against Christianity in the 13th century in France. And clearly this is an apologetic. Clearly, it's clear that this bracha was not written about empires that well preceded the writing of it. You could argue that maybe it had to do with Rome to an extent, but the ending about his being grateful for the Pope and French Christians. Obviously, he had to defend Jewish life, and that required him to speak in certain ways. But you can understand that he's trying to figure out a way to save himself. But there's no way you win a debate of these sorts, right? It was out to lose from the very get-go. But that's one incident. When the Cairo Geniza was unearthed a century or so ago, some of the Geniza texts that came mostly again from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, had different variants of the text itself. And in those texts, we often retain the word notzrim. So it does potentially hint to the fact that the word notzrim, Christians, may have been either the original text or a very early part of it, because in Christian lands, Jews could certainly never say that bracha. But if you're living in Fustat or you're living in Baghdad, so yes, there were Christians in both of these locations, but just like Jews, Christians were a minority. So Jews could get away with essentially cursing them out in a public synagogue, something they could not do in Christian land. So it might hint to the fact that the original bracha may have been about notzrim. It's interesting. I did not bring the source for you, but the Gospel of John, I'll just give you, it's chapter 12, verse 42. I sound like a missionary on a subway. So Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 42, says that the new Christians, and again, he's writing in the 1st, 2nd century, new Christians, meaning Jews who are now joining the fold of the early Christians, were afraid of being kicked out of shul, right? Essentially, he doesn't use the word shul. He says that but he explains that they were afraid because essentially he's probably referencing at least an early version of this bracha, or at least an early incident where Jews were kicking out anybody who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So you see how even in the New Testament, the Gospel of John is referencing some early disputes between Jews and early Christians. So it's likely that it was a reference to early Christians, but it's not definitive. Because until we see texts that were literally written in the 1st century that still exist, we can't really rely on something that was written 900 years later, because again, the word could have adjusted over the centuries. There's another word I wanted to add, right? What do we say in the Ashkenazic text? The meshumad, right? The apostate. It's interesting in some Jewish texts that were written in the Arab world. So they kind of explain that the word meshumad, which means an apostate, it comes from the word like shmad, meaning like somebody who is destroying us, right? Because somebody who leaves the fold, it's destructive to the individual, to the faith. So in Arabic, the Arabic word for an apostate is meshuamad, which is very similar to the word meshumad. It just adds an ayin. which essentially means somebody who is standing. It's the same word in Hebrew as omeid. Meshu amad, it's like the word amad, standing up, which essentially meant somebody would stand up and they would be baptized. And so it's the same word for being baptized in Arabic. And so Jews like the Ibn Ezra writing in in Arab lands would explain the word meshumad in our context as really being meshu amad, again, Jews who converted to Christians. So both in the Arab context and in the Jewish context, in the Christian context, meshumad meant someone who left Judaism and went to Christianity, or you're a Muslim, left Islam and went to Christianity. So it does seem to be this continuous kind of circling around the particular issue without stating it explicitly in later texts. But nevertheless, any Jew who saw the word meshumad would know exactly who it was. I want to show you a pretty extraordinary text. In case the other ones weren't extraordinary, here's another extraordinary one by Rav Yaakov Emden. Rav Yaakov Emden, living in the 18th century, it's always easy to remember his death. He died in 1776. So Rav Yaakov Emden, living in Altona, so he writes the following about this particular bracha. Remember, he's living in a context. It's the early modern period, where certainly there's Jews and there are Christians, but Jewish-Christian relations in these areas were much better than they were 3 centuries earlier. So he's explaining this bracha, and I want you to decide whether or not you agree or disagree with Rav Yaakov Emden's description, or whether you even think that he's describing something that he truly believed to be accurate. He wrote the following in a work that he wrote, Luach Eresh, which was a larger work that he wrote about arguments and claims and disputes. He wrote, "It is the same for us whether the one who leaves his religion is a Jew who becomes a Christian, Muslim, Indian, or African, or if he is an adherent of one of these religions, meaning a non-Jew, who becomes a Jew," meaning in reference to our bracha. "If his heart is not true with God and he is not faithful to the God of his spirit." So says Rav Yaakov Emden, what is this bracha about? It's about a Jew who leaves Judaism to become a Christian, a Muslim, an Indian, African, just referring to different cultures, religions. And the same bracha that we daven for is also against people who leave those religions and join ours, because it's about being faithful to the one in which you were born into. "For he does not do so, but rather converts as to rebel against the king and Lord, or to take vengeance on his family, seeking to humiliate them in this way, or for another reason, like setting his eyes on wealth, or for the desires of a woman, or something else." And he continues, "If he has left his previous religion that was implanted in his heart, intellect, and faith for any of these reasons and accepted any other religion, even if it is our holy faith, he does not truly believe in it," etc., etc. That is what our bracha is referring to.
Is this somehow in the spirit of, this is just after Shabtai Tzvi?
So this is certainly during the same time period. I did not confirm as to in what year he wrote this. So, but certainly this is certainly after Shabtai Tzvi.
I just happened to discuss it yesterday with someone, that there's very little documentation from that time, because people were so ashamed of the fact, Rabbanim, that they accepted him, that they destroyed everything.
Yeah, that's definitely possible, right? Shabtai Tzvi is a few decades before this, in 16.
He died in 96.
Yeah, exactly. So, but Rav Yaakov Emden was obviously famously arguing against many potential Sabbateans. But what's interesting here, whether or not you include the Sabbatean issue into this bracha, is that he argues that this bracha is not only about Jews leaving Judaism, but it's about any person of faith leaving their faith to even join ours. There was a fear, certainly in the medieval period and going through even the early modern period, that a non-Jew would convert to Judaism. Now, it's certainly less likely than a Jew converting out to Christianity, but the issue was always that if somebody would accept Judaism, so that could often cause issues for the Jewish community, right? If the Jewish community started to have people convert to Judaism, that would be problematic. So Rav Yaakov Emden here seems to be addressing that at least on a secondary level. And I think what he's doing here is somewhat an apologetic, but it is somewhat inaccurate. And I think he knows it, right? I think what he's trying to do here is defend the bracha, but also somehow kind of using philosophical terms, try to explain out that we Jews also don't want people of other faiths to become Jews, which, certainly we're not a people who are missionizing, but if somebody faithfully converts to Judaism, certainly we're not pushing them out in this bracha. But nevertheless, he seems to be alluding to that or explicitly stating that in his commentary here. So
yeah, but excuse me,
yeah.
but doesn't he say joining the faith under false pretenses though?
That's a good point. So maybe he's only talking about false pretenses, but it would seem from this text, and it's part of a larger text, that he thinks that potentially any change of faith, of true faith, meaning a faith that believes in a God, would be inaccurate. It would be inappropriate, unfaithful, unloyal for somebody to make such a switch. So he thinks that the bracha itself is about people who do that, even if they become Jews. It seems to be that he's kind of defending the bracha, trying to eat his cake and have it too. So that seems to be perhaps what's going on here.
Was that also a fear of spies, of people who pretend to join Judaism, to use that for the Christians?
It could be. I don't know how many of those there were. Often there was enough information about our practices from Jews who left, but certainly that could be incorporated. Within this thread, I wanted to bring you a text from Rav Jonathan Sachs Tzal, who similarly states something along those lines. If you look at it here, he says, "What's this bracha all about?" This is his commentary on the Siddur. He wrote, "The text of this paragraph underwent several changes during the centuries. Its original object was the sectarianism that split the Jewish world during the late Second Temple period." Again, vague on the language here, but meaning rightfully so, right? We don't really know what the original text was. There were Jews in the Hellenistic age who turned against their own people. Faith, emunah, in Judaism involves the idea of loyalty to a people and its heritage. This prayer is a protest against disloyalty. And I think it's certainly true that it's a text against disloyalty. But what I would say is, if you tie this into the Rav Yaakov Emden piece, it seems to be that the bracha really is against disloyal people who were originally Jews. But you can't really flip it on its head and say that it was also about people who became Jewish, right? You can't go that far, but certainly disloyalty is a good way to understand what this is at. It's a theological disloyalty, it's disloyalty to God, to Torah, to our people. And I think that's a very kind of accurate way to kind of, in a very objective manner, talk about this particular bracha. I want to conclude with a few thoughts, which is that this bracha, as it made its way into the 19th century, underwent even further changes, right? If we don't really know what the original text was, maybe it was notzar, maybe it was meshumad, maybe it was min. We don't really know, although all those were true at some point in Jewish history. Once you get to the 19th century with the rise of the Reform movement, so for example, the Hamburg Temple, the first Reform temple that essentially established its own siddur, so they originally amended the text to remove any reference to people who were wicked, but talk about wickedness in general, right? Risha, wickedness, which also appears in our text, but eventually they removed it altogether. And that for many years was the approach of the Reform movement, to totally remove that particular bracha. Rav Schwab, who writes famously on the Siddur from his lectures that were written down, says that you could understand this bracha as not only talking about sectarianism 2,000 years ago, or even Christians today. He says, you throw in communism. Again, he's talking, think about, during the Cold War, right? Throw in any group that officially rejects the idea of God, rejects religion, rejects the ability for people to pray freely, to practice their religion. Those people are incorporated in our bracha as well. So what essentially began as a sectarian argument among Jews eventually had to redevelop itself when there weren't necessarily as many Jews who were the issue, right? They were arguing against non-Jews, Christians who live among them, and Christians who were ruling over Jews. Within that context, you have Meshumadim as well, apostates. But once you get into the 19th, 20th century, it was less of a fear, and you had to now talk about other forms of idolatry, essentially. And so there were different interpretations, and I think the phrases that we have in the bracha itself that came to us today do lend to a more open way of understanding the bracha, right? Again, because of its vague language that was developed over time as a way to conceal the original people in which the bracha was essentially written against or written for, right? So we talk about oivim, right? The enemy of the Jewish. Could be non-Jews, could be Jews, it could be many different people. So essentially, it's trying to curtail some of the more harsh language, but nevertheless, certainly this bracha remains in our Amidah today. And while the original meaning may have been changed ever so slightly, it still talks about wickedness and the need for God to avenge our people by destroying wickedness in this world. I did have an additional piece which you can look at on the source sheet, which talks about the origin of the word tikva. In the piece, you can look at the piece in Yirmiyahu, the word tikva. It says, destroy the people and their hope. The oivim destroy their hope. Why are we talking about their hope? Hope is a strange word to just throw into a bracha of this sort. But it would seem that the word hope in the context of Yirmiyahu and in early texts, hope is a reference to a return to the land of Israel. It's a reference to Tchias HaMeitim in Yirmiyahu. So what do we not want them to have? A return to the land of Israel, a return of Tchias HaMeitim, which may also tie into the early Christian reference. The word tikva is coming up in Yirmiyahu about, Rachel Mivaka al Baneha, right? It's not talking about non-Jews. So that's another potential key to understanding the original meaning of the text. I'll now obviously open it up to questions and comments. We'll continue next week with another probably more, 2 or 3 brachot next week. Thank you all for joining me.
So your focus has been looking at the objects of this bracha, groups, institutions, but not individuals. So is this not supposed to refer to another Jew who does evil or does evil towards you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say in its original context, it certainly was a reference to groups of people, and obviously individuals make up groups. But I think, picking up on what Mark said earlier, the previous bracha about mishpat, justice, does make reference to, if somebody sins and if somebody continues to sin and hurt Jews and hurt kind of the Torah, so we want justice to be meted out against them. This bracha seems to focus on more egregious groups of people. I definitely think you could have a kavana for a wicked individual, certainly, but I think the language speaks in the plural, as does much of the Amidah, right? So certainly one could add kind of thoughts toward an individual, but then you do run into a whole nother host of issues, which perhaps is a discussion for another time, which is, are Jews allowed, is it proper for somebody to essentially curse out somebody else, an individual? Is that a proper thing to do, even if you're in the right, right? It's not so clear that that's an appropriate thing to do for one individual to do it for another individual, while it's a whole nother conversation and it seems to be permissible for a group, a community, to curse out another community.
But this seems like the only bracha, as far as I can remember, that is not specifically a positive bakasha in Shemona Esrei.
Right.
So it's
not positive and it's not a bakasha, really.
Yes, we're asking for destruction the same way that we ask for mishpat, justice. What does justice mean? Justice means some people are found guilty and some people are found innocent.
Right.
So this is an extension of that bracha, which is to say that part of, again, remember, it's sandwiched in the redemption brachos of the Shemona Esrei, right? This is the brachos that are beginning, kibbutz galiyot, mishpat, tzadikin, right? This is that this is the way to redemption. The way to redemption, part of the pathway, is essentially this, right? It's kind of a messy addition. Again, important to remember that we ask God to do these things, not us. And yeah, essentially, it seems to be that we are asking God to specifically mete out justice because maybe we weren't clear enough in the first bracha because things are getting bad. So it was a bracha that was added during a very particular period of history, and note how it was not taken out. Meaning, often there can be a decree that is just for now, right? That can happen in Jewish history. We have a decree for now, but it's not going to stand forever. This one stood the test of time, potentially because it was about early Christians.
Mhm.
So it's
But it could be could be put in a more less of a negative form, like give us the strength, the ability, the commitment to be loyal and to believe and all that, rather than to curse out, as it says.
That first part we've already done, right? That's the beginning of the Amidah, right? We ask God for forgiveness. We ask God to hashivenu, right? That's the first steps. But once you get to this part of the Amidah, and again, since it is the national piece, that kind of ties into what Garth was asking about, individual people's groups, it would seem that part of the national redemption of Jewish people involves the removal of, whether you call it heresy, that would be more internal to Judaism, or potentially which is wicked kingdoms from among the earth, whether it's a reference to Edom, Christianity, Rome, or other idolatrous groups.
Fascinating.
Could one of the reasons
Thank
one of the reasons that it has stayed in the tefillah be because that was the beginning of a very long, dark period for Jews?
Yes.
It's not like there was a reason to take it out.
That is true. That is certainly so.
Even today.
That when it was established, it certainly continued down a downward spiral for the Jewish people. But I think, getting back to the question of, was it originally supposed to be in forever or not? We don't know. Meaning it says tikain, they fixed, they established. That usually references something that's supposed to stand, right? Like a takana that remains in place. But we don't necessarily know if that is truly the origin story, if really it was supposed to be forever, or looking back 3 centuries later when we wrote the story down, we said, well, obviously it was a takana to stand forever, right? If early Christians or early Sadducees disappeared in the 1st century, so maybe it would have ended, but it seems to have continued for centuries. And even if one could make the argument, it would be hard to make that none of these groups or none of the people that we're trying to reference, whether it be any of the groups you mentioned tonight, no longer exist or no longer are supposed to be cursed out, that we should remove it. Then you might get into questions of minhag or whatnot. But I think certainly there's enough memshelet zadon in the world that warrants a particular bracha.
I have a question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. I won't keep you long. We went on a tour of I forget, a Judaica collection, and in Italy apparently they did a lot of censorship. Do we know if they kept this in the Italian?
So if you're interested in a more expansive kind of version of this, of looking into all the different texts, I would highly recommend Dr. Ruth Langer's book. She goes into extensive detail as to all the different traditions and rites and to how it looked. So I don't know offhand. What I do know is that almost every siddur, I can't think of a siddur offhand that removed the bracha entirely, but certainly words were changed and censorship was certainly a piece, and both Jews censoring it to protect themselves and also Christians censoring it themselves. I mean, in many siddurim, I can just give you by way of example, the Aleinu, which the verse about kind of idolatry, which was seen as a reference to Jesus, whether or not that's the original reference or not, it was seen that way, certainly by Christians and probably by Jews as well. In many siddurim, it was removed, yet if you look in older siddurim, there was a space. Meaning, hint, say something now, meaning the text of Aleinu remains with a gap. And many Sidurim, there could be even Sidurim on your bookshelf that have that, meaning it's not that ancient that it wouldn't be on Sidurim you have today in your homes, that there was a gap. So again, that could have been the case, or perhaps for certain words that was the case.
The Yekish Sidurim doesn't have it at all.
Which?
This day.
Oh, that verse.
Aleinu.
Yeah.
That verse in Aleinu.
Yeah.
I didn't know about it until much later.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, I think I talked enough. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Fascinating.
Good night.